Hey friends, I'm Cameron Nations, and welcome to Signs and Wonders, a study of the Gospel of John. I am really excited to embark on this study with each of you. John's Gospel is such an interesting book. Even though it tells the same basic story as the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John's Gospel is different in some ways too that I think give us a unique perspective on who Jesus was and what Jesus came to do. You see, John actually tells us why he writes his gospel, though he does it at the very end rather than at the beginning. In John chapter 20, verse 31, so right at the end, there's only 21 chapters in the Gospel of John, so this is right at the end, okay? John writes this, he says, "But these things," this gospel, these things, "are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." You see, John is a devotional gospel. And what I mean by that is that John is an invitation to deeper life in Christ. John is an invitation into deeper discipleship. And that through our encounter with Jesus in John's gospel, we would be changed and transformed and have life in his name. Now, this life-giving gospel doesn't just convey information to us, okay? Like I said, it invites us into this deeper life in Christ and points us to a new way of life, a new way of living. Because that's what John's gospel is all about. It's not just Jesus' teachings, though we get a lot of those in John's gospels. John's gospel is also interested in us emulating Jesus' way of living. Not just what he taught, but what he did and is doing. That is what this study aims to explore, okay? We'll walk through the gospel more or less in order. There'll be a couple of sessions where we'll jump ahead just a little bit, but by and large, we'll try to keep it in order and go chapter by chapter. It's my intention, actually, that this study would be kind of like a companion, a commentary, or a guide that kind of you read along with the study, basically, okay? So we're not going to try to jump around too much. But before we dive into the book itself, before we actually crack it open and look at chapter 1, verse 1, I wanted to take some time in today's session to look at the context of John's Gospel, to talk about when it was written, under what circumstances do we think it was written, how does it differ from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which I've already talked about a little bit, referred to a little bit. Well, I want to do all of those things in today's session so that next week we can dive into the book itself, armed with a little bit of understanding and knowledge about the context of John and how that context shapes the way that we view it and read it. So unlike the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay, John's Gospel is a little bit trickier to date. Now, biblical scholars argue about everything endlessly, okay, but they also argue about when John's Gospel was written. Some argue that it was written earlier, some argue that it was written later, and still some scholars even say that parts of it were written earlier and parts of it were written later, okay, so you know, go figure. You can kind of best of both worlds, I don't know. But it is a difficult gospel to date. Now, I think whenever John was written, we know that it has to have come sometime after the year 70 AD, okay? And that is because something really, really important happened that year that was utterly transformational and life-changing in the life of the early church and in the Jewish community in which the early church was springing up. And that was this: the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. You see, Rome was controlling Judea and Jerusalem and basically all of Rome, let's be real, Rome was controlling basically everything in the first century. We read about Herod the Great in the Gospels. Well, Herod was only the governor of the Galilee in that part of the world because Rome let him be. Even though Rome wasn't an occupying force, Rome was in charge. You got your power because Rome let you have it. Now, in the year 70, Rome actually did come into Jerusalem, and they did destroy the temple. They laid siege to Jerusalem, and the temple was destroyed. And this was huge. This was such an utterly disrupting event in the life of not just the early church, or not just the Jewish community at the time, but also in the early church. And here's why. Now, you may remember that in the Gospels, Jesus actually predicts the destruction of the temple. And this was kind of an unthinkable thing, even though it had been destroyed once before, about 500 years previously, okay? And actually, that's why we have most of the Old Testament. There are really two, outside of the creation of the world or in the universe, there are really two events that birth most of the Old Testament, and that's Moses delivering the Hebrews out of Egypt. That's the first thing. And the second thing is the destruction of the temple and the subsequent rebuilding of the temple. Those two events, the delivery of Israel out of Egypt and the destruction of the temple, basically accounts for most of the Old Testament. Those two events are why most of the Old Testament was written, okay? And so the first time the temple was destroyed was hugely disruptive, but that was a long time ago, and most of Israel thought, well, things had been put right. Things are fine now. The temple's rebuilt, everything's okay. And so when Jesus predicted that it would be destroyed again, this was truly revolutionary and earth-shattering and very upsetting, which is one of the reasons why when Jesus predicts that it's going to be destroyed, people don't like it very much. They push back on Jesus. Sure enough, though, in AD 70, temple's destroyed. Now, to understand how this impacted early Christian communities, we have to pause for just a minute and acknowledge the limits of our language here. And what I mean by that is when I say early Christian communities, we need to understand that those communities themselves wouldn't have understood themselves as Christian, okay? In fact, there were principally two main early Christian communities. And again, it's the limits of language. I'm going to keep referring to them as Christians, but that's kind of an anachronism. Okay, they wouldn't have thought of themselves that way. But there were pretty much two main early Christian communities. One of them were Jewish Christians, which is an imperfect term, but it's the best I know to use. Okay, so these were Messianic Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, okay, but who still basically did everything like they did before, pretty much, right? They still went to synagogue, they still, kept Sabbath and all that sort of stuff. And there was a lot of debate about what parts of their Jewish practice they needed to maintain in order, now that they were Christians and the Messiah had come. Again, I don't really like the Christian's not really the right way to refer to that, but you get what I'm saying, okay? So there was this Jewish community of Jesus followers, we'll put it that way. The other part of the early church were Gentile followers of Jesus, and we read a lot about this in the New Testament. This is the work of Paul, right? Paul's planning all of these churches and converting all of these dirty pagans to the Christian faith. And in fact, much of the New Testament is just arguments about, is this possible? Can Gentiles actually be grafted into the people of God, right? And there's this language of adoption and that sort of thing. And Paul arguing about, do you need to be circumcised to be a Christian? Because that was a big part of Jewish, right? Like all of these, you see it in the New Testament, okay? So this was kind of the big debate that was raging on in the early church. Okay, now what does this have to do with the Gospel of John and the destruction of the temple? Well, here you go, right? Temple's destroyed in 70 AD. You have this group of Jesus-following Jews who are still hanging out in their Jewish communities. After the temple is destroyed, this causes a big rift. And those Jesus followers who were part of these Jewish communities get pushed out. They get cast out. Because, of course, they're regarded with intense skepticism now, right? Like these folks, their fellow synagogue mates, look at them and they're like, okay, your guy predicted this would happen and we thought he was just full of hot air, but like it happened. So, they get cast out. They get cast out of these communities. And it was clearly very painful for them, which makes sense, right? Anytime that you have schism or, this sort of ripping at the fabric of a community, it hurts, it's painful. And so we're pretty certain that the Gospel of John was written by one of these communities of Jewish followers of Jesus who had been cast out of their synagogue and their community. We see hints of this not just in the Gospel of John, but also in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the Johannine epistles that appear in the New Testament. Okay, so this is why we think it was probably written after AD 70. So there's this interesting context of conflict that and pain that births this gospel narrative. Okay, so I want to make sure I don't leave anything out of my notes here. So one of the reasons that this is really significant for us today as we read the gospel is because we see the critics of Jesus in the Gospel of John start to be portrayed more generically. So, we always see the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and all that sort of stuff. And you do see the Pharisees listed in the Gospel of John, but you also start to see something interesting where folks who are maybe oppose Jesus' teachings, or in some cases just oppose Jesus outright, are referred to as the Jews. And this is interesting, of course, because Jesus and his followers were Jews. And so the fact that the gospel refers to these other Jewish people as the Jews, as in opposition to Jesus, as if Jesus wasn't Jewish, again is one more hint that this gospel was probably written after 70 AD, okay? Now again, why that's important for us is because, unfortunately, John's gospel has been employed in Christian history to some pretty anti-Semitic ends. We see this actually in the Middle Ages really significantly when Jews were cast out, for instance, of England. Since we're Episcopalians, that seems kind of important for us. So anyway, we have to be careful as we read the gospel now that we don't commit that same sin of anti-Semitism by somehow thinking that there's the Jews and the Jews are bad, and then there's Jesus who's good, as if Jesus wasn't also Jewish. Okay, so we just have to keep that in mind, okay, and be careful about that as modern readers. So that is the context of the Gospel of John. John is a gospel that's written probably in the midst of a lot of conflict and pain, and is used by a community of Jewish folks who are trying to figure this messianic thing out, what it means to live and be as Christians, and figure out what it meant that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. So earlier I mentioned that John is a little bit different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, even though they all share the same basic story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, okay? I also used a word to refer to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that word was synoptic. So before we go any further, I think it's important that I define that word so we all know what it means, okay? It's not a word we use very often. And by very often, I mean we don't use it ever, okay? Unless you're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the word synoptic means with one eye, okay? That's all it means, synoptic, with one eye. And the reason we refer to Matthew, Mark, and Luke as the Synoptic Gospels is because it's clear that they are very closely related. They bear a really close textual relationship. Now, a lot of scholars think that Mark was probably the earliest gospel. It was probably the first gospel, and then Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source to write their own gospels. And we see this because if you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are certain passages where you can see phrases, like exact phrases from Mark, that Matthew uses almost verbatim, and then Luke will use too. And they may kind of, turn some things around and things like that, but you can see this very close thread, okay? So those are the Synoptic Gospels. So that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But then we have John, and John's over here kind of doing almost his own thing, okay? So I want to talk about some ways that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are a little bit different than John, okay? So stylistically, they are kind of different. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke read more like what I would call maybe reporting, okay? They have a sort of reporter style, especially Mark. Mark is very brisk. Mark's gospel is all about well, they went there, and then this, and then this, and then this, and then Jesus said this, and then he taught this, and then this guy was healed, and then they went here. Mark is just and. It's just basically one long run-on sentence, okay? So Mark has a very reporter's kind of style. It's like reading a newspaper almost. Matthew is a little bit different. Matthew is sort of focused more on the rabbinic tradition. Anyway, Luke is writing history, so the Gospel of Luke is actually the first part of this longer book. Acts is part 2. Okay, so the Gospel of Luke is really part 1 of this 2-part history of the early church, starting with Jesus and going to the mission to the Gentiles and that sort of thing that's talked about in the book of Acts. So Luke's doing historiography, Mark is just trying to get it all out on paper, and then Matthew's kind of doing something in between. Okay, so stylistically that's the synoptics, but John is very different than that. John's Jesus talks a lot. Okay, John's gospel is not so much interested in like they went here and then they were here and then they went over here. In John's gospel, Jesus does a lot of talking. And if you have a red letter Bible, this is really apparent because you can just open and flip through and you see how in John's gospel it's just like page after page after page of Jesus talking. Okay, and this is very different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which have smaller snippets of Jesus's teachings or speech. Another way, so that's one way, stylistically they're different. They're also different in terms of the way that they situate Jesus. And what I mean by this is the Synoptic Gospels situate Jesus historically, while John situates Jesus theologically. Okay? Think, for instance, about the Gospel of Matthew, right? Matthew begins very famously with this long genealogy that nobody ever reads, okay? But what Matthew is doing here is situating Jesus historically. And John's Gospel, as we'll talk about in the next session, begins with this really epic prologue that kind of connects us back to Genesis. In the beginning was the Word, right? And the Word was God, or the Word was with God, or the Word was with God, or the Word was God, right? That's how John's Gospel begins. John is situating Jesus not in our present historical timeline. John is situating Jesus in a theological timeline of eternity. It's a little bit different, okay? So that's another way that they're different. They're different stylistically, and they're different in the ways that they situate Jesus. Another way that they are different, and this is a big way, is in the content of Jesus' teaching. So in the Synoptics, we get some of Jesus' famous stories, and that is, or those are, I guess I should say, the parables, right? The parables are one of Jesus' most famous teaching techniques. But interestingly, John doesn't include any of them. We don't get any parables in the Gospel of John, which is really fascinating. Now, we do get something that's like parables, and we'll talk about that in a future session, but we don't get any parables, okay? So that's another reason, or another way, rather, that the Synoptics are different than the Gospel of John. Synoptics, parables. John, no parables, okay? Very interesting difference there. Now, there are some stories that we get in the Synoptics that we also get in the Gospel of John, like the feeding of the 5,000 and things like that. But there are a number of stories that are unique to the Gospel of John. A couple really big stories, actually. For instance, Jesus' first miracle, the wedding at Cana, where he turns the water into wine, that only appears in the Gospel of John. It doesn't appear in the Synoptics. Another story, really big story, really cool story actually, that only appears in the Gospel of John is the raising of Lazarus. Y'all may remember this story, right? Lazarus, Jesus' friend, has been dead for a few days, and Jesus weeps at the death of his friend, and he goes and he yells at Lazarus, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus comes out and he's wrapped in bandages, and it says he even stinks a little bit because he's been dead for a few days. Amazing story, okay? But that's only in the Gospel of John. So there are a number of stories that we get in John and nowhere else, which I think is really cool. Without the Gospel of John, we wouldn't have those stories. So I'm glad that we have them, okay? And again, there is some overlap where, like the feeding of the multitudes, that happen across all the Gospels. So that's another reason, or why do I keep doing that? Another reason that John is different. It's not a reason, it's just a way that John is different. That's a reason. Guys, I've been trying to record this for a while here. We're just going to leave these in. This is raw footage here. So anyway, that's another way that John is different, is that there are certain stories we get in the Gospel of John and not in the Synoptics, and vice versa. Okay? Now, the last way that John is a little bit different is the way that Jesus kind of acts in the Gospel of John. So in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus sort of struggles a little bit with his vocation and what it means to be the Son of God. We see this, for instance, in the Garden of Gethsemane, right, where he prays in agony that the cup would pass from him, and he sweats rivulets of blood, you know. I mean, this sort of agonizing prayer before his brutal execution. Whereas in the Gospel of John, Jesus is like cool as a cucumber the whole time. He knows he's here to come to die, and he's fine with it. Right? Like he's on top of it, he's got it. It's just a very different portrayal of Jesus and Jesus's character. But that fits into some other things in the Gospel of John that we'll get to later. But that's one difference that you'll notice when you read the Synoptics. Jesus is a little bit earthier. When you read the Gospel of John, Jesus is like, you know, he's ready, he's got it, he's prepared. Okay. So those are some ways that John is different than the Synoptics. John doesn't have parables. Synoptics have parables. John has a lot of Jesus' speech. The Synoptics read more like reporting. John situates Jesus theologically. The Synoptics situate Jesus historically. Ultimately, these are not like just earth-shattering differences, but I do think they are crucial to what John is wanting us to see about, again, who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do. So one more distinctive about John's Gospel is its very clear literary structure. John is very carefully composed. It begins with a prologue, which we're going to look at next session. Okay, it begins with a prologue. It's got a section right after that about signs and wonders, which is the reason the study is called Signs and Wonders. Okay, so we've got the prologue. We've got a section of signs and wonders that Jesus performs. And then we have this pivot point in the middle of the gospel, which is the story of Lazarus. Okay, remember I mentioned that. It's a story that only appears in John's gospel, and it marks the pivot from the first half of the gospel to the second half. Okay, and then the full second half, all of the second half of John's gospel is focused on the cross. It's all about the passion. Okay, that's John chapters 12 through 20. 8 full chapters of the book are nothing but the passion narrative. That's a lot. That's far more than any of the other Gospels devote to it, which I think is one more, not just difference in the Gospel of John, but one more tip for us about what John really wants us to see and focus on about who Jesus is and what he came to do, right? So not only do we have a prologue, we have like part 1, which is John 1, chapter 1, verse 19, all the way through chapter 12. So we've got like this kind of 12 chapter-ish first section. Then we've got story of Lazarus, and then we pivot to John chapter 12 through 20, which is the second half. And then we do get an epilogue in John chapter 21. Okay, so John's got this really clean, very neat structure, which is I think tells us, again, something about its composition and tells us something about the care and the craft with which John was trying to get us to see Jesus' life and story. Now, it's not just the entire gospel which is carefully crafted. You'll also notice that each story within the gospel, okay, like each little episode of Jesus' teachings or journey or whatever, each one of those is also very carefully crafted and has a very conscious structure and purpose to it, which is part of what makes John's gospel so rich for us to read and study and explore. Okay, so yes, so John has a very carefully constructed structure. It's very purposeful in its construction, and it's all about the cross. So I've taught a study on the Gospel of John before, and I based that study largely on a book by a guy named Adam Hamilton, who is a Methodist pastor. He's the head of the Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas, right outside of Kansas City. And he has a book called John, the Gospel of Light and Life. And light and life are in fact two themes that we see woven throughout the entirety of John's Gospel, from the very beginning in the prologue to, as we saw at the very beginning of today's session, all the way to the end of John's Gospel, right? What is it that John tells us he's doing when he's writing it? We already said this. I wrote these things so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that you may have life in his name. So next session, we'll pick up with these themes of light and life, and we'll look at the prologue to John's Gospel, as well as most of chapter 1. We may get a little bit into chapter 2. So in the meantime, I invite you, crack open a Bible, go online, pull up your phone, wherever you read your Bible, open the Gospel of John and begin to read, starting at chapter 1. And next week, we will get through chapters 1, and like I said, maybe part of chapter 2. We'll kind of look and see where we are and go from there. But thank you so much for joining me for this first session of Signs and Wonders, a study on the Gospel of John. I'm so excited to explore John's Gospel with you. It's such a rich gospel that has so much to offer and so much to speak to our present time of challenge and adversity. So again, thank you for being with me today, and God bless.